So BC, it looks like we are all set.
Yep.
Excellent.
We're just waiting to be moved into the live session.
Excellent.
Nick will know how many people are online already. So,
sorry?
I said Nick will know how many people are in already.
Okay.
Sure. I just clicked the broadcast button, so people are starting to join. I'll do my introduction in about right at the top of the hour.
Okay.
Awesome.
Perfect.
Thanks.
Mm-hmm. Hello and welcome to everyone joining. Just a quick overview of the webinar experience that you'll have here and the resources that are present as an attendee. You'll see a chat button. That'll be an area for panelists if they choose to share any links. As well, there's a Q&A box. So there's a button there for the ability to ask questions to any of the panelists and presenters throughout the session. And they'll go through and review those responses and address them to the audience. As well, there's the audio settings on the left-hand side. So you're able to adjust your volume, select your speakers. And with that, I will turn it over to our moderators to welcome and kick off the event.
Hi, everybody. My name is James Gavi, and I'm an editor on the economicslaw.org blog and a professor of law here at Loyola University Chicago. Thankful to our IT team here for hosting this and all the technology support. So welcome to this webinar on vulnerability in the trade and investment regimes in the age of COVID-19. We have a great team of speakers here, and I'll soon turn this over to my colleague on the blog, Professor Akinkube Olabisi. I just want to say just one or two things about the overriding purposes of this webinar series. And the overriding purpose is to have a discussion about the issues that matter most to countries and peoples of the Global South, broadly defined in the international economic order. Often in the last couple of months, the discussions in the international economic law have focused primarily on the trade wars between the leading economies and leaving little space for the types of discussions that we've tried to encourage on the blog. In addition, a major mission in designing this webinar series and the content on the Afronomics Law blog is to encourage more academic scholarship, and all our speakers here will be contributing towards that at the end of this. We are delighted to have all of you policymakers, academics, activists, well-wishers, friends here, and I'm looking forward to this conversation. And I'm delighted to introduce Professor Akinkube, who will be our moderator this in this webinar series today. So, Bisi.
Well, thank you very much, Professor Gathi, and good morning, afternoon to all our participants from what we think now is all around the world. We also do want to thank all our panelists for being here with us today. Without much ado, we do plan to hope a very interactive and hopefully conversational webinar over the next hour and a half. Our panelists will have 6 minutes of opening remarks that they have promised us they'll keep to, and then we will move on to the questions that you, the participants, hopefully will have for them. The key, just to highlight a point that Professor Gathi has made, is which we hope really this does in terms of the conversation, is that quite apart from the broad focus on IEL in the Global South, there are so many, again, proclivities that has not been attended to in these conversations, or even where they happen in silos, where people haven't been on the table really speaking to each other about the same kind of issues that they face, albeit in different regions of the world. So we do hope that what our panelists promises us today is a flavor of that, and that we count on all the participants, as many as we can take, to come in on that with the questions. Now, if we're unable to take your questions, we're not promising, but we hope we can follow up with our panelists and hope they can oblige to respond to what may be particular questions, and then we can provide our feedback to you. But in any case, as Professor Garcia said, we hope you can interact with not just what has been done on the platform, but the academic scholarship that comes out of this. So thank you very much. And if that is it, we'll now be ready to get on to Dr. Claire Camage.
Thank you very much, and thanks for having me here today to speak to my section on this particular issue of South-South cooperation and the global pandemic. But before I start on that, I think there's a really useful statement that's come out from UNCTAD, where it says that the COVID-19 crisis is stress testing the capacity of governance arrangements to deal with unexpected shocks. And so my first point really is that whilst the global economy is structured in highly unequal forms, and whilst countries in what we would term the global south and the global north have very different types of economies and different patterns of growth within their economies, the pandemic has affected economies across the world. And I say that as a scholar situated in the global north, the economy I'm in the UK, for example, the amount of debt we've taken on is now worth more than our economy, and we're in the greatest level of debt we've ever really been in. So we are a country that's currently showing, as a developed country, just how significant the pandemic can be. With that, and as primarily a trade lawyer, but a trade lawyer with a great interest in international trade and development, what I'm also interested in from the pandemic is the way that we're seeing the intersections between international trade, international investment, finance, public health, all intersecting with one another. And this speaks to what Bizi has just said around silo thinking and the need to break free from that type of thinking in order that we can form resilient responses to the challenges that the pandemic has revealed. Now, whilst the pandemic has resulted in declines in world trade and in investment and finance globally, and whilst it has affected countries irrespective of their pre-existing state of economic development, it is certainly exacerbating and deepening structural inequalities that exist between and among countries, and especially developing countries and least developed countries, or those that we would term as those in the global south. What we've already seen is that the reactions to the pandemic have exposed those fragilities and the vulnerabilities in those economies, but those are vulnerabilities and fragilities that scholars have long recognized as existing. But nevertheless, the pandemic has shone the light on those fragilities and vulnerabilities. James has mentioned already the impact that this has had on the global south and the need to really look on the way in which the pandemic is affecting global south countries. It's worth remembering that South-South cooperation is actually supposedly based on partnership, on equality, solidarity, and cooperation. And that cooperation can come in many different forms, be it technical assistance or knowledge sharing, financial resources, the way in which we transfer data, for example, between countries. And what we've already seen prior to the pandemic, but what the pandemic has really been able to reveal in very plain sight, is the way in which the economic structuring of South-South cooperation is itself a hierarchy. So we've already got a hierarchy of oppression existing within that bloc itself. And I say that because we then can look at the role of China, which formally sits within that dichotomy of global south, global north, is in the global south. But China, as this emergent actor within this group, has intervened and responded in different ways, which is problematic to the growth of other global south countries. We know that South-South cooperation is difficult to measure, but we also know that China has already played a really significant role in trade and investment flows and financial flows to global south countries. We also know that global South-South cooperation is key as a driver for development and sustainable development within the 2030 agenda. However, my concern is that the pandemic shows us just how those asymmetries and hierarchies within South-South cooperation are being deepened. We're seeing the ways in which different economies can respond to the challenges being posed by the pandemic. For example, those economies like the UK, where the majority of our workforce is in a formal economy, we have structures in place by our government to respond to the pandemic. But it's very different when you look at a developing country where the 70% or 80% of the economy is in the informal economy, and where those workers have no choice but to go to work, irrespective of the risks they're putting to their lives. So moving forward, and something that I've worked on and continue to work on and will probably be my life's work, is to think about what the purpose of trade is. If we're looking at multinational institutions, if we're looking at regional trade agreements and regional institutions aside from those agreements, what is their purpose in this grand debate around trade? Trade has to be part of the solution. The World Trade Organization has said that. But what should that solution look like? And what role should South-South cooperation play in terms of that solution? We have challenges at the multilateral level, which will create a difficult response, difficulties in getting response from the WTO, but it also poses a good opportunity to think about how we build resilient responses. And for me, I think that when we look at, say, for example, the AFCFTA, which is a new and innovative opportunity to challenge some of the hierarchies and asymmetries that do exist in multilateral institutions. There will be a need to ensure that there's participation that's meaningful, that it's multi-stakeholder. So you're not just looking at experts, but you're engaging communities. and that we need a deep and meaningful interrogation of the legal, political, and regulatory norms and interests that shape and inform interactions between those state and non-state actors. The reason for that is that trade and investment are no longer simply taking place bilaterally between states. Indeed, they're happening generally through global value chains. And that creates further complexities in terms of regulating and governing those spaces. I don't know how I'm doing for time. I feel like I've spoken quite a lot. Beezy, how am I doing?
Very well, if that is the end of the remarks.
That's it. Yeah, there we go. I'll end there then. End on a high.
Thank you. So Dr. Gamage has started us very well. So thank you very much. I mean, you've thrown out a lot of ideas there. I won't bother trying to summarize anything now, other than to say that we have Dr. Jean-Yves Remy now giving her own remarks. Thank you.
Thank you, BC, and thanks to the conveners of this meeting, this webinar, which is striking a note on a very important conversation that we have to have, and we have to have now. So the time is quite opportune. 6 minutes, obviously, is not a lot of time to get into specifics. So I'm going to make impressionistic broad strokes that hopefully with the questioning we can fill in later. By way of introduction, I'm Jani Remy. I work at the Sridhar Farm Center in the Caribbean. And one of actually my colleagues is here, Miss Alicia Nichols. And we, about 6-7 months ago, whether by premonition or just good luck, we resurrected this idea of vulnerability, which has been bandied around a lot in trade circles, especially at the WTO. But we did so in response to a very specific threat. What was at the time a consideration of what objective criteria should guide the approach to special and differential treatment at the WTO, which for those who are not specifically trade cognoscenti, really special and differential treatment is, you know, the flexibilities or the added flexibilities that would be given to developing countries in a trade context. And what we were really responding to was the gross national income per capita metric that some, aka the United States, was introducing into what was previously self-designation in terms of who should be eligible for this special treatment under the rules at the WTO. And so we use that as a basis to construct. We brought in an economist, Mr. Jason Cotton, from the CDB. Alicia and I worked from the SRC to come up with what we termed a trade vulnerability index, which took vulnerability literature and indices that has been developed since the 1990s to a new level, in the sense that we were trying to apply it and assign a numerical value to the level of vulnerability that certain developing countries face. But then COVID struck, and two things happened almost instantaneously, both that helped and hurt our vulnerability cause. So I think, as Claire and some of the other speakers will make plain, vulnerability now has become a claim not just for those that we would have foreseen as being privy to the Trade Vulnerability Index proxies, but it has become a term of art almost in COVID, where beyond the country level and at the sub-country level, those marginalized groups within countries, healthcare systems, unemployed, mortality rates, all sort of lend towards this claim that more people than just small developing ones could lay claim to this idea of being vulnerable. The second, as I said, that kind of helped us a little bit is that it heightened, especially among Caribbean policymakers and governments, it heightened the clarion call for the need to look very specifically at how certain countries within the international community could respond. So not just that they were subjected to this pandemic, but what was their resilience? What was their ability to respond to these kinds of shocks? And in the very specific context in which they were making the claim, for instance, debt relief and concessionary funding, the term vulnerability was very much and is very much now being associated with the Caribbean and small island developing states, something that the G20 itself has given air to. And so what this caused us to do is look again at our trade vulnerability index, reassess it, shop it around a little bit in trade circles, and see how we could make it better, make it more responsive. So our current task, and I'm hoping that this discussion will assist us in doing so even more, is to not only understand its dimensions, because we now have a health pandemic, which is to add to one of the stimulus that may lead us to thinking more tangibly about vulnerability responses, but measuring it and ultimately refining the messaging about its applicability. And that's where we think our task will be hardest. On the first and second scores of measuring and understanding its dimensions, I think that's really an economic discussion to be had, because what that is trying to do is to look at the structural capacities and environmental sort of shocks like climate change, hurricane disasters that plague our countries, but also institutional factors that we can use to measure a country's predisposition to trade shocks, but also on the resilience side, look to see the ability of countries to overcome these shocks through governance and institutional mechanisms. And the test there is really to just refine the proxies we use. We've been looking at things like export concentration, trade openness, susceptibility to trade shocks, susceptibility to remoteness, smallness, but also the institutional as well as the governance regimes to respond to these. And at this stage, the economists among us will be looking really to test this through economic analysis and modeling. The second one, and I'm going to end here, BC, is really the harder part, as I mentioned, because what we have found is not that persons don't understand that there's not only vulnerability that is accentuated in certain countries and can be measured through our TVI, but really it's a question of what you do with that. So that alienates the conversation from the developed countries who think this is just another reason that they'll have to be giving out more preferences, but also among developing countries, because for them, it's another whittling down of the common claim to developing country status and flexibility. So what we want to do with the TVI is to think about how we will be able to use it in our trade negotiations. How does it help to mitigate, predict, provide solutions to specific needs that a country may have, not just as a country level, but also at a sectoral level? How does it help to make the case for trade responses to some of these vulnerabilities, but also importantly show us what the limits of a trade response are? So how trade negotiations cannot help stem some of the problems that we face as smaller and developing countries. So to close, I think, and we can get into all of the ways and the nuances we can use this TVI, I think what we want to do through COVID and what COVID has given us as a gift is to reclaim vulnerability, the story, refine it, and find a way that it can be even more relevant in creating the narrative for why certain countries at the global level deserve certain treatment as a trade response and by the international community to endogenous and exogenous characteristics that they face. Thank you very, very much.
Thanks a lot, Dr. Remy. It's another very fascinating presentation, and I think that even with both presentations, a lot is being mapped already, right? In terms of how much we don't we haven't maybe deconstructed this whole notion of vulnerability. You know, despite the fact that in 2019, UNCTAD had that report, right, where they talked about trade and vulnerability. It was very limited in its scope. So thank you very much. What I do want to say to our participants, though, is that Professor Gathi will come back at the end of all this to really also put some light on how you can engage and look forward to academic scholarship that relates to this theme that Afronomics Law is already working on. Thank you very much. So with that, I think we're set to listen to Professor Saka.
Thanks, BZ. Can you hear me properly? I'm asking that because my internet connection was for the last 10 minutes very bad, so I could hardly hear what was said, which probably brings me to exactly the point I want to make, but I hope you can hear me. So my remarks go into the direction of digital trade and vulnerabilities in that regard. So we do know, obviously, that digital solutions have been used in that whole crisis to overcome problems, to kind of continue economic, social activities. And the observation here is that this was just possible for few. One has sometimes the impression that it was for most, but actually not when one looks in terms of population. So large parts of the world are actually not able to make use of those digital solutions due to the gap in digital readiness. And that's what I wanted to point out in my reflection, that it has shown economic opportunities that some could use, and we don't have to mention the likes of Netflix, Amazon, Microsoft, and all. They skyrocketed in the value and all of that, and there are some small businesses that could tap into that potential. But the vulnerabilities are also digital economy that came out here, and there are some that actually concern all countries, and there I can make the connection to Jan with regards to it's not always just the developing countries. So the disruptions of supply and demand change is felt by everyone. Consumer protection issues, cybersecurity, that is, these are issues that everyone is concerned with. But then there are very specific issues that actually just experience developing countries, or more specifically least developing countries, which are most of them situated in Africa. And there are many, many stats that one could bring here to prove the point, but one of the most striking might be the internet access. Only 26% average of people in Africa have actually internet access. That of course varies drastically among the countries. So with 1.3% in Eritrea and the likes, and 56 to 58%, that's the highest for Tunisia, South Africa, and Morocco. So you have a huge gap also within Africa with regards to accessibility. But the point is that in average it's 26%. So why is that, and what are the problems? And one of the biggest problems is costs and infrastructure. That's an obvious thing. With regards to costs, again, there are striking stats of costs for broadband per month of $2,600 plus dollars. But with the highest in Eritrea, but also an average of 200 sometimes per month, which is unable to be paid. Then besides those costs, which are just a given, it's sometimes even no network in a lot of rural areas. For many countries, you can't even find stats because they're not available. Also with the speed of the broadband network, African countries are at the very last. So we can go on and on with that. We can go on with load shedding and electricity not available, and then disrupting the internet access and so on. I cut that here. Lack of skills is of course, and knowledge also a problem. Access to online payment solution poses a problem of using those digital solutions. Other things, visibility in online research, for advertisement, for companies. These are very practical things in order to actually get your business going online. I have here very high tariffs for telecommunication devices, partly for 30 to 40%. Then obviously the normal one is consumer trust is here even worse than somewhere else. So what I wanted to say with that is that not only is a lot of African countries in the digital divide on the ladder on the bottom, but questions and narrative is always told in e-commerce, they call it e-commerce negotiation still, which should be actually changed to digital trade negotiations, because that's what it is about. And that is that developing countries benefit from digital. And I would say first, that's not that easy with the current state. So one has to at first elaborate, can they actually benefit in the way they are equipped at the moment in readiness, and what one has to do in order to actually can truthfully say that. Obviously, they have done a lot of short-term solutions. I mean, Kenya was a master in putting these balloons in the rural areas to give the rural areas 4 gig, but not every country can do that. So infrastructure is a big problem. So my question would then be at the end, what long-term ideas can pose? And Claire said we should ask us what's the purpose of trade, and what can it contribute, right? And in long term, that internationally at the multilateral, plurilateral level, I don't see there any agreement on a digital trade agreement, and precisely because developing country concerns, or rather developmental concerns, are not so much on the agenda there. Therefore, we will see a blocking for continuous blocking and have to focus on the regional level. And what can we do there? The AFCFTA was mentioned. And I think one can actually think about using it as a test and say, let's focus in the AFCFTA on creating digital rules, but our own ones, the ones we need, with a developmental integration approach, thinking actually about data localization, which is a taboo on international level completely after India tried very hard against the US to get that through. But one can again try that. How does it work to use the actual data created by digital transactions for own citizens for development, at least at regional level? Competition is one issue that would have to be addressed, because we have a highly concentrated industry where already the market is almost actually determined who owns what. So it's actually questionable how you get in that still as a big company. But in order to at least discipline their behavior in other markets, need to implement competition rules, in my opinion, in order to prevent further inequalities in the market, and can maybe think about using a chance of creating here different rules, of maybe using this S&D special differential treatments mentioned by Jan in a different way, and try to distribute the opportunities better. But that needs to be very careful crafting, because there's so many things involved. I don't have time to mention them all, but it's also, of course, intellectual property. It's the question of consumer protection. It's the question of how one actually does regulate that, because it's all with private law issues and not so much traditional trade law issues that have usually been not included in a trade. So digital tax was tested by France to the upsetness of the US again as well, which was very interesting to read, to actually put a digital tax on electronic transmissions and all these things. So to end with is the idea of how one could do that at a regional level is maybe a 3-step. First, it's clear we have to regulate or try to reduce tariff barriers for data flows in order to facilitate digital economy also in Africa. But the second, to what extent do we restrict it, or do we have to restrict it? So which rules do we have to find? Whether that is likable by others or not and called digital protectionism doesn't matter. We have to think about it. And at the last level, that would be special and differential treatment for the mere fact to be able to navigate the big divide within Africa and to adjust to the different speeds the different countries are at. But this would be my suggestion for the 3 levels. But it was said before, there's so much issues that I could tap in that I leave that for discussions that would be interesting. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Soka. It's interesting. I mean, you've touched on so many issues that that I hope our participants are really looking forward to engaging some more with you, no doubt. So with that, I'll turn it on to Professor Matengai Salif, who will be the next speaker now.
Thank you for that. And thank you for inviting me into this panel. I'm learning a lot here. My background is in public international law, and specifically global public health law is where much of my research and writing has been focusing on of late. And so my perspective is going to focus more on the health vulnerabilities that have been exposed by COVID-19 and the ways in which the international financial regime sort of intersects and exacerbates those health vulnerabilities. And I want to focus in particular on the ways in which this might play out or is evolving on the African continent. And so thus far, the African continent and countries on it have been spared the worst of the pandemic, but the United Nations Economic Commission released a report not too long ago indicating that anywhere between 300,000 and 3.3 million African people could lose their lives, and already we are above that number. The latest Africa Centers for Disease Control numbers indicate that 306,567 COVID-19 cases are confirmed across that continent in terms of cases. In terms of deaths, we have 8,115 deaths and 146,212 recoveries. And so the numbers continue to go up, and they are particularly stark and geographically clustered in a couple of countries. In South Africa, we have 97,300 cases. In Egypt, we have 55,200 cases. And of course, all of those numbers are only reflective of the robustness of testing that's taking place and may not actually represent the actual number of infections. But I think what COVID-19 does, as it's done sort of globally, is expose systemic healthcare vulnerabilities in places that are conceived of as the global north, and showing the ways in which those vulnerabilities are exacerbated in countries in the global south. And so my remarks will focus on how international financial institutions have sort of limited domestic health spending in a way that has prevented health capacity from developing. And so to do that, I want to go back a little bit to think about the role that institutions like the International Monetary Fund have played on the continent and elsewhere in terms of providing loans to encourage the structural adjustment of economies as a condition for extending and refinancing debt. And austerity measures usually included things like cutting the budget deficit, improving the balance of payments. So countries were required to establish budget ceilings, wage caps, and other reductions in the public sector. And so as the public sector shrunk and was mandated to shrink, this limited the amount of money that was available to employ and adequately remunerate robust health sector, including doctors, nurses, and other healthcare professionals. And so as healthcare employment opportunities lessened, healthcare quality, capable healthcare workforce also decreased, and those seeking greener pastures left because of depressed wages. And so this contributed to the brain drain problem in much of the continent and elsewhere in the global south, where indigenous talent leaves for more prosperous pastures in the global north. And so through the prioritization of short-term economic objectives over sort of long-term investments in public health, the result was a predictable hollowing out of the health sector. And this is indicated in a number of studies that have shown the ways in which IMF's policies and others have slowed down improvements in, or actually worsened the health status of people in countries that have implemented them. So for example, an independent evaluation of the IMF's loan program surveyed 29 countries in sub-Saharan Africa between 1999 and 2005 and found that 37% of all aid revenues were diverted to beefing up currency reserves. And then another 37% was dedicated towards repaying debts in line with structural adjustment. and that left only 27% for the social sector. And that's including health, education, and the like. And so, of course, this correlation doesn't equal causality, but the cumulative effects of the structural adjustment programs is one that detrimentally impacted health systems globally, and this had a particularly pernicious effect in the global south. And so we saw this in places before COVID emerged, for example, with the Ebola crisis. And it was illuminating because during the Ebola crisis of 2014 and 2015 in West Africa, the IMF belatedly recognized the connection between its policies and the outbreak, and made recommendations about increasing the fiscal deficit because it's a matter of curing people, and that this seems to be occurring again, where there have been attempts by the G20 and others to temporarily freeze the debt of African countries and to free up funds for increased spending on health as a way to respond to the pandemic. There's also been a number of suggestions for trying to prevent the collapse of health systems more broadly through increasing budgetary support. And so while there are a number of suggestions that are on the table, I don't have that much time. Actually, I'm at my time right now to go into them. But what I will just say generally is that much more than what has been announced thus far needs to happen. I think what the COVID-19 pandemic has shown is that there is the potential for the world to react in a way in which we had not imagined, right? How quickly governments have been able to mobilize and to institute policies that few would have imagined. And I think that also creates a space then for changing the ways in which health is prioritized in budgets, by international financial institutions and by other regimes that intersect with the health systems domestically as well as with global public health. So I'll stop my remarks there.
Thank you very much, Professor Salif. I think you've ended on what is a very interesting point. And if I could use the moderator's prerogative here to just draw your attention to what's the very interesting dynamics at the very local level of how some of these issues play out. So I'm quoting from a Nigerian newspaper, which is The Punch. And I'll be quoting a governor speaking quite unfortunately in respect of what the state would have done for one of his chief of staffs that was that died as a result of COVID-19. So here he says, well, 2 lines before that. On Monday, the governor of Osun State ruled the recent death of his deputy. In eulogizing the deceased, quote, "We would have flown her out for treatment, but for COVID-19 pandemic." The irony is they don't get it. So you are hitting a very important point on the one hand at the international level, but it just seems the guys at the local level, and quite rightly as you've landed on the budget issue, which I hope our participants will take on, is in a different world entirely. Even as we are concerned with all these issues, they still wish they could travel to get treatment, right? So thank you very much for that. Ms. Nichols, for her own 6 minutes.
Thank you, Professor Akinkunmi, and good day to all. My name is Alicia Nichols, and like my colleague, Dr. Gianni Bremi, I work at the Schroeder Fraunhofer Center here in beautiful Barbados. Investment is not a focus of our Trade Vulnerability Index, but many of the proxy indicators which Jan mentioned, which we use to explain vulnerability in the trade context, also apply in an investment context. So for example, our small size generally reduces our attractiveness to market-seeking FDI, and also results in the uneven bargaining power dynamic between foreign investors and Caribbean governments when negotiating investor contracts and concessions. FDI inflows to the Caribbean remain largely undiversified in terms of sector and origin, making us vulnerable to sector and origin related shocks. So for example, in recent years, Barbados saw a drop in its FDI to its offshore financial services sector due to changes in the Canadian tax law. With respect to dependence on external finance, a 2018 ECLAT study found that in most Caribbean economies, inward FDI as a share of GDP in the period 2008 to 2016 exceeded 6%, making them sensitive to variations in these inflows. And another perfect example, and I could speak to this from experience because I actually worked in the sector at the time, was after the Brexit referendum result, Barbados saw a precipitous drop in real estate FDI flows from the UK into its second home market because of the devaluation of the UK pound sterling relative to the US dollar. With respect to our susceptibility to weather-related shocks, in the aftermath of Hurricane Maria's devastation of Dominica in 2017, a major offshore university, which had been in that country for many years, relocated to another Caribbean country. Now, as fellow panelists have rightly noted, the COVID shock has further exacerbated our vulnerability. So for example, the IMF forecasts that FDI to the Bahamas in fiscal year 2020-2021 will drop by 50% year on year, and the same applies to several other Caribbean countries. As a silver lining, however, COVID-19 has hastened efforts for improving the ease of doing business by forcing more government and private sector services online. And I found it interesting when I read the UNCTAD World Investment Report 2020, where it noted that in the Dominican Republic, MNEs engaging in medical supplies have expanded production. So how can we build resilience in an investment context? First, ensuring coherence between a country's investment, trade, and industrial policies, informed by and aligned with its broader strategic development objectives. Second, seeing the diaspora not just as a source of remittances, but of FDI. Why? Well, foreign investors are generally motivated by profit and not necessarily the host country's development imperatives. Diaspora investors generally have both a profit motive, but also a patriotic desire to assist in the development of the homeland. Third, accelerating regional investment policy harmonization efforts to reduce any race to the bottom in offering incentives and other concessions to foreign investors. Fourth, mobilizing sustainable FDI for inclusive growth and in new growthers. So Jamaica's JAMPRO, which is their investment and export promotion agency, really has been top of the class in this because they've already identified priority sectors that they're targeting. I'm soon finishing. Fifth, accelerating investment facilitation efforts by prioritizing online payment systems and information portals to allow for open and predictable conditions for investment. Six, importantly, we must critically examine whether our international investment agreements, more specifically our bilateral investment treaties, are fit for purpose. Most are older generation bits, lacking, for example, express provision for the state's right to regulate in areas such as the environment and public health, while retaining broad and vaguely defined standards of protection for investors and their investments, which of course increases our government's legal exposure to costly investor claims. Now, we are not rich countries, we're financially constrained. On that note, Caribbean governments should support calls for a coordinated multilateral solution to the expected influx of investor claims under investment agreements in response to government's COVID-19 related policy measures. And finally, despite having a strong development interest in investment matters, Caribbean countries generally remain on the periphery of international investment rulemaking. We're mainly investment rule takers and not rule makers. Our governments, therefore, should consider the feasibility of formally engaging global initiatives, such as UNCTAD's working group on ISDS reform and the pending WTO negotiations on investment facilitation for development. Thank you, and I look forward to any questions.
Thank you very much, Ms. Nichols. I mean, as I hear the rule takers, and I can't but wonder if Professor McCann Bengwe was here, how much he may be happy about that. But we'll leave that to hear Professor Perron's remarks on this panel. I should say to our participants, just before Dr. Perron goes on, that if you have questions, please feel free to type them We're taking note of them. We've seen those that have come in, and we will swiftly move to that once Professor Perron finishes his remarks. Over to you.
Thank you, Olabisi. Thank you very much for the invitation. I mean, I'm glad to be talking to all of you this morning, afternoon, evening for those in different parts of the world. So, I mean, I want to use my 6 minutes to talk about vulnerability and international trade. I think it's fantastic that we are talking about these two words together, or these two issues together. So, I mean, I'm glad that you put together the two topics, and also the other speakers referred to these already. And the point I want to make is a very brief one, is that international trade, the way it has developed in the last 20, 30 plus years, has accelerated considerably. So the speed of the transaction is much faster. And this has created vulnerability for a lot of people around the world, particularly in the global south, but not only. And so I want to focus on that particular type of vulnerability and see how it has developed with COVID-19. So this is the situation of workers and small firms and factories in the global south, particularly, but not only, who are plugged into the global economy through global value chains. So I'm talking about, if you, for instance, take the garment industry in many parts of the world, or here in Chile, where I'm now, the fruit industry for export. So these are sectors that are connected to the global economy, plugged to the global economy on the basis of short basis, or short transactions, one-off transactions, very fast transactions. So it's not a question, if you think about a long-term relationship, but rather they take orders quite, on a routine basis, and they need to comply with those orders. So what happens is that they cannot really, think much. There's this situation of social acceleration that creates vulnerability, because they are always needing to ensure that they're going to get a next contract. So ILO has already found out that this situation puts these firms and the people who work for these firms in a bad situation, because it means that it's very difficult for people to get to negotiate terms, because what's going to happen next is unknown. It's always to be seen. It's always working on these one-off transactions that occur very fast. What COVID-19 has done with these global value chains, it has stopped them. Suddenly those orders that were coming in stopped. And the way those contracts are organized, and Francisca touched on that point, and the importance of private law and private international law for international trade, that's something that was very important in the first part of the 20th century that we got forgotten after GATT and the WTO. It's key here, because those contracts allow you to terminate them with no penalty for the big players in the global value chains. So this was before COVID-19. Now, of course, with COVID-19, it means that those companies and those workers that relied on those orders for their livelihood kind of got completely cut off. They have no mechanism to continue, producing income for them and their families. So what the International Labour Organization is trying to do in this context, what is the ILO COVID-19 call for action, is to try to make the firms who are, like the big buyers in these global value chains, those who control the global value chains. What they're trying to do is to keep the global value chains alive, to maintain some of the orders, to pay those orders, despite the contractual terms that are very favorable for them. So try to get firms on board in this sort of voluntarily basis to keep this thing going on. Now, I think this shows the situation and the different ways, the different opportunities COVID-19 is offering us to think about vulnerability and trade, for instance. One of it is, okay, let's see what we can do to go through the situation until we can go back to normality. Normality being this very this organization of global value chains that is very fast and based on one-off transactions that favors the firms that have the most of the power in the chain. But I think there is a problem with that if we are really going to take vulnerability seriously. So if you want to, my reflection is whether this is not the opportunity to tackle the ground rules that organizes global value chains. What will happen if we think either perhaps we don't want this very fast global economy, as we can see that it creates a lot of anxiety and vulnerability on people, or perhaps we want to allocate the risk and costs of this very fast economy differently by trying to understand and reshape the contracts that put in the economy together. Because something that I think trade lawyers sometimes overlook is that we do have WTO plus free trade agreements rules on top, organizing the way the economy operates. But below, we also have this web of networks, of contract networks and transactions that are also putting pressure. And I think if we focus on the everyday life of individual people and groups and communities, those contracts have a lot of impact on their lives. And it's not only, investment agreements, but also, I'm thinking about like a producer of fruits and vegetables in a country like Colombia. It's not only the investment agreements that matter, but also, the kind of networks where they are able to sell their products. And if those networks operate on rules that put them in a vulnerable situation, then we also think about tackling those networks as well. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Nicola. That was well done. And indeed, thank you to all our panelists for keeping this moving, but also already showing the overlapping conversations that we indeed have promised to have today. So without much ado, I will be moving on to taking the questions. We have some of them now, and we had one way before the panel started, so I think we should start with that. That question was posed to us by certain Mr. Nelson Ndurangi. I do not know if he's online, but I'll read it for the purpose of participants, and I'll implore any panelist that wants to answer this one, it's general, to just unmute and go for it. I'll please implore you to keep it to 2, maximum 3 minutes, so that we can go to as many questions as possible. Thank you very much. So the first one is, what would you consider to be an ideal trade and investment regime between a developed and a developing country? Please highlight the elements. Now, this is broad, and I can maybe use the moderator's prerogative to toss it around and say, do you imagine, to our panelists, that there can be such a situation?
If I may, if I could take this one, I think how I interpreted the question is that possibly whether what would be the ideal agreement, maybe IIA or DIT or what have you, between a developed country and developing country, how would that look like? So when I'm thinking about that, I'm thinking about the work that UNCTAD and IISD would have done, talking about the model investment treaties for sustainable development. So including things like the express right of the state to promote development and to regulate, development related exceptions. So for instance, provisions allowing for restriction of transfer of funds in balance of payments emergencies, for instance, including corporate social responsibility provisions, more active investment promotion provisions, especially now since we're seeking to mobilize financing for development to meet the SDGs. So, I mean, a lot of those things you're seeing in agreements, not just between developed and developing countries, but you're seeing them in things like the CPTPP. I'm never good with that acronym, sorry. The investment chapter in there. So I think it's a good question, and I'm also curious what other panelists might think as well.
Thanks. Yes, Dr. Gamage?
Oh, thank you so much. And to build on what Alicia said, I'm far less optimistic. I know that sounds really bad, but my view is that if we look at the progress that has not been made in the WTO setting, for example, and I think it was Jean-Yves who mentioned SDT, special and differential treatment, We know that preferences have not integrated countries in the way that they should have done, or the way that we envisaged that they would have done back in the 1970s when they were introduced. And I think that the starting point is that if you want an agreement that is genuinely going to promote fairness and justice and equality, then you have to rewrite the rule book, and that's simply not going to happen. But what I do think is like Alicia's just said, you can incorporate certain clauses. You may have additional exceptions. You could have additional safeguard mechanisms, for example. But actually, I think it was it was Alicia, I think, and even Fran talking about specific sectors and issues within those developing countries that you need to identify. And that then links on to what Jean-Yves had mentioned around this trade vulnerability index. You have to look at what sectors are important within each country to see how a trade agreement will actually affect those sectors, and therefore linking in with what Nicola has said, how that then affects workers. So we have these WTO plus statements within a lot of free trade agreements, but they don't actually often help the workers to get better terms of trade or to promote the ILO's conception of decent work. So I think that if we're looking at the way in which we could create a better regime, it goes back to needing to reform institutional frameworks within those regimes, but also having really genuine and meaningful engagement, almost interinstitutionally, around what is the financial commitment, what is the trade capacity, what trade facilitation is available, what technical capacity, where is the money going to come from to support all of these things. And that's going to require a whole group of individuals in order to do so.
Something, if I may, BC,
Yes.
just agreeing with what my predecessor said, and not a terribly helpful suggestion or intervention I have here, but I think sometimes those of us in the trade policy world and who work at the realm of the government, intergovernmental agreements, feel our inadequacy or feel the inadequacy of trade agreements negotiated at that level to really affect the lives and the livelihoods of those operating at the sub-state level. And I think there are two elements to that, right? One is the role of the non-state actor now, and especially when we talk about digital transformation and the role of these huge behemoths like the Facebooks and the Amazons and all of these agents that are not participating in the discussions but are having these huge impacts on lives. And I think Nicholas's point is bang on. It's, you know, you see the levels at which what the government is doing and what the government can negotiate really doesn't capture the lives of the man on the ground and the woman on the ground. And that happens at the level of the gender discussion, that happens at the level of the digital economy discussion, that even happens at the level of the investor-state interactions. So governments can put in as many clauses as they want about the right to regulate. And I agree with Alicia that, you know, governments should do as far as possible in the regimes over which they do have control and in the areas over which they do have control. But I think, in line with what Claire is saying, that the conversation and the basis of the discussion needs to be more inclusive, and it needs to recognize the actors operating at the sub-state level and the super-state level, those operating who have higher GDPs, higher amounts to wield power that sometimes, you know, dwarf countries' GDP. And I think that's what we're feeling in the trade world. It's not just, you know how non-biting S&DT provisions are, but that there are other things operating that are just not being captured, and so cannot force the change that we need to happen, because it's beyond the state and the state's capacity to influence and affect the direction in which our economies are going. I just kind of wanted to put that in. We could do as much as we can at the government level, but let's widen the discussion and be more open-minded about where the discussions have to go.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you very much.
If I may, BC, just
yes.
to add I completely agree with what my predecessor have said, Jean-Yves. I think she put it very, very clearly. And I just wanted to add that you said to us, can you imagine that? And I think that's something we need to reflect on. You know, I mean, do we have the means? I mean, the tools, the toolkit to imagine it. You know, perhaps we need to create it as well, and that's a task for us academics, I guess, as well. You know, to imagine not just how that trade regime would look like, but what are the conditions for a better trade regime? What toolkit, what tools, for instance, the notion of vulnerability, all these things, they need to be developed, and they need to have as much credibility as, I don't know, in terms of trade, for instance, subsidies or safeguards. The term vulnerability needs to get that catch and get that capital with it. We need to work on developing that term, for instance, or others. So I think it's about, making that imagination come true. And that perhaps is more of a process than a goal that, okay, I already have in my mind what's the best trade deal. I don't think there is a best trade deal to start with, perhaps, but it's about, having a conversation and giving us the opportunity to imagine in that, which requires a lot of work. It's not just, as Jean-Yves and Claire were saying, it's not just, okay, let's think about the best trade deal. It's about developing the tools and the ideas and discussing and sharing them with friends and colleagues and all those things. So I wanted to touch on that performative aspect of having a better trade order. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Nicholas. So that's very interesting, and I think I like the interactive nature of the answers. So dear panelists, if you want to jump in, please just go ahead. So I'll go to the next question, which is from Paloma Fernandez. Do you think, as a result of a post-COVID world, some EU regulations that affect directly trade from countries of the global South will be strengthened or dismissed?
Well, I went already, so I'll wait for others to jump in, but I do have a response.
You can go ahead, and then we'll have others. Yeah.
I will keep it short. Just last week, actually, I was invited to a discussion on precisely this comment. And the very modest suggestion that I made is, when you look at the countries that have notified export restrictions to the WTO, the EU, I think, has about 3 or 4 rows of restrictions. And what's really interesting about the nature of the export restrictions that they imposed, like every country would to protect its national supplies of, very critical medical goods and PPP. I've never heard of PPP so much as in COVID. But what I found really interesting was, as one of the countries with which the EU has negotiated an EPA, in fact, we were the first region, the Caribbean, with which the EU had negotiated EPA, we did not fall among these countries that are carved out of the export restrictions. So the regulations, basically where they held on to their supplies, and yes, it was time bound, and that is understandable. But one of the things that we're hoping to happen as a result of these kinds of pandemics is for countries that cannot move into indigenous regional supplies for certain types of products. Yes, as a result of the pandemic, we have re-indigenized some of our manufacturing at a high cost, because access to the raw materials and the input materials for a Caribbean region are always going to be high, and that will have to come with time. But for things we cannot source ourselves, like reagents and aspects of the kits and ventilators, although again, we've gone into, some of our university students have tried to do ventilators, the suggestion is that we should, having that protected relationship under the EPA, be carved out of these export restrictions that will basically mean we have no access to them. And the EU still is among one of the top, if not the second top, places where we source some of these PPP. So that was one area, is that in the future we would be carved out of any export prohibitions of this kind, and that in the future, vaccinations that are created that as a result of our trade relationship, we would have access to these vaccinations, because being small, again, we will not be first in line. We're not LDCs that would get it through, debt relief and concessionary relief. We are in this middle category of high GDP per capita, but being so small as not to be able to command world prices. So we kind of find ourselves in that little space. And there are other ways that I think the EU can make good on its obligations to its ex-colonies and the ACP through these negotiations that they have with the EPA, under the EPAs, that I think would be a stroke of goodwill. to countries that depend really on them at critical times like these. So that's just my shot there. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much. Yes, Dr. Gamage?
I have to respond to this, 2 minutes, because Paloma was a former student of mine. So hello, Paloma. It's lovely to connect you through the Dominican Republic as we speak. I'm sure it'll come to no surprise to anyone who follows my work that I think that part of the issue for the EU and its relations with global South countries, first is I don't like the term global South, even though I use it, but it's a homogenizing term. And as Johnny has just said, every country is situated differently. It has different needs and all of that. But the real issue is that the EU is not just a trade actor, it's a normative actor. It's got commitments to uphold environmental standards, labor standards. So we have these very complex rules around sanitary and phytosanitary measures, which means that some of those undiversified product bases that we have in developing countries must comply with those. Even if it's not with SPS, it's with technical barriers to trade and labeling regimes. And so if you don't have the infrastructure there to satisfy what the EU requires of all its trade partners, you simply can't access the market on those terms. So I think that what COVID has shown me is that the EU will probably seek now to identify aspects of those markets that are important to the EU for future pandemics. It will probably be keen to ensure that there are favorable rules for the EU within those particular sectors. And that should also be a bargaining point for developing countries to think about what they want from the EU, because it's become apparent that there are lots of things that the EU needs from them.
Thank you very much for keeping it short and straightforward. So I'll exercise a little bit of moderator's discretion in here. And I think I'll flip the questions. So if Professor Matengai Salif doesn't mind, I want to bring her into the conversation by suggesting, if you don't mind, that you take the questions from Professor Selintan and Dr. Cosmas Emezian. Do you mind taking both of them together? And then we'll come back to the order.
So I have one of them, which is on health vulnerabilities linked to the IP regime and what do I think about TRIPS. But the other question,
I could read it, if you don't mind.
Okay, how do we make sure loans are directed towards strengthening health infrastructure? Is that the question?
Not exactly. It's around that. This is a question for Martin Gaisalev. You mentioned the idea of creating greater fiscal attitude for countries to combat Ebola. Yes, how did this fiscal space translate to greater policy space? Yeah.
Okay, so there's a separate question from Patrick Anam. Sorry.
Yeah.
Let's go to that.
If you want to take the three, I'm happy.
Okay, I can. It's hard to keep up with the Q&A. Yeah. So the first thing I wanted to do actually really was to just reflect on what you mentioned at the outset of after I spoke, in terms of the ways in which the elite and those in power have now, because of COVID, been forced to rely on the weak healthcare systems in the countries that they exist in. But for many of them, prior to COVID, they would just go overseas to seek medical care, whether that's in Europe or the United States or say South Africa or Ghana or India or somewhere else. But border closures and travel bans now have made it impossible really for them to rely on the health infrastructure of places elsewhere, such that they are now subject to the same horrible health systems that much of the population has to rely on and has to depend on, which includes capacity constraints. For example, in Burkina Faso, there are only 11 ventilators for a population of 20.9. In Sierra Leone, 13 ventilators for a population of 7.9. 3 ventilators in Central Africa for a population of 4.8 million, right? So the situation is actually quite critical. Should the pandemic take on a substantial amount of cases? Because the idea elsewhere in the global north and elsewhere is that you're trying to flatten the curve by making sure that the health capacity can respond to whatever initial shock there is to the demand for intensive care units. But in a number of places, we are talking about non-existent healthcare capacity to even absorb the initial shock. And so COVID-19 presents even more vulnerabilities than elsewhere. And so connecting that to the question about how to think through the application of loan funding to the health system, I think that there are a number of ways of thinking about this. I mean, one thing is you might hope that the self-interested nature of the fact that now political elites are subject to these horrible health systems that others have been subject to, that might lead to reprioritization of budgetary amounts that are allocated towards health in a way in which it wasn't done before because they didn't think that they had to rely on those systems. There could also be ways in which there is a direct tie-in of investment towards beefing up the health infrastructure in countries. And so I think that that's something that would be meaningful and helpful. So I think that there are creative ways to think about making sure that more funds are dedicated to health infrastructure. But I think there also needs to be a fundamental sort of rethinking through of, prioritizing budget ceilings at all costs when we have seen the devastating implications that this has for health and other areas in the social sector. So I think that that is a general statement of something that needs to happen. And so to respond quickly then to Patrick's question about, so sorry, I just responded to Patrick's question, but to respond to the question about, from Dr. Msmes about health vulnerabilities and connecting that to the IP regime, I think that the IP regime is certainly complicit in this as well. I just focused my remarks on the international financial institutions, but I think that there's a way in which the TRIPS regime has severely limited the capacity of a number of countries to really make room for the flexibilities that are supposed to be within it to get access to essential medicines. And even the amendments that have been made to the TRIPS regime and the Doha Declaration and other things like that, that are supposed to elucidate how TRIPS is supposed to be not in conflict with public health concerns or public health emergencies, I think do not and have not gone far enough, in particular because what has happened is that other countries have engaged in sort of TRIP plus treaties with countries where they are requiring additional requirements than the TRIPS regime does through bilateral treaties. And that then puts restrictions on countries who are in those bilateral and maybe even sometimes multilateral treaties that severely sort of restrict their capacity. But I think even as a baseline regime, the TRIPS regime is fundamentally flawed because I think it doesn't sufficiently prioritize research and incentivize research in a way in which it would be responsive to diseases that predominantly, disproportionately impact countries within the global south. And so there is a way in which I think the regime is structured to facilitate diseases of wealth and to make sure that, so if you have the ability to pay, then you have the ability to access drugs. If you don't have the ability to pay, then you don't have access to life-saving medicines. And the regime sort of prioritizes that structure in a way that I think is detrimental. And I can go into that, but I think that would absorb all of the time. So I'll just say that as a principal matter, and then perhaps we could talk more elsewhere. And then lastly, the question about, that's directed at me about, I lost the last question.
Fiscal space.
Okay, okay, I see it, thank you. Fiscal space to combat Ebola, yeah. So the reason why I mentioned that is because I see sort of the same pattern repeating, but part of the problem, after the Ebola, and actually during the Ebola crisis, right? That's when the IMF was like, oh yes, we need to increase the fiscal space. And then now during this pandemic, the IMF is saying, oh, we need to increase the fiscal space. But the problem with epidemics and pandemics is that this isn't something that can be done as a reactionary measure, right? So if you don't have a robust healthcare infrastructure that's set up to respond to a shock of an epidemic, that can't be remedied sort of after the fact, right? So creating the fiscal space during the crisis or after the crisis is in fact too late. And so it's insufficient. I mean, it's necessary that the IMF say, yes, we're going to create more fiscal space, but that actually needs to be a baseline, right? That needs to be a permanent thing, not something that is reactionary or temporary, because then it just gets reversed, and then the next epidemic emerges, the next pandemic emerges. And I think that there's actually going to be an increase in seeing such vulnerabilities with global warming and climate change. The amount of vulnerability that countries will have to emerging diseases, infectious diseases, is not going to decrease, it's going to increase. So thinking through how the financial system internationally responds to that has to be one that is based on sort of seeing this as the norm, not as a variation from the norm. I'll stop talking, thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, Professor Salif. And as you spoke about the national context, again, corruption just flew out of my mind. I was just like, that's another whole maze in its entirety. So thank you so much. Now, if I could again prep our panelists for the questions that may come to them. We have here, I have to say, my friend, Dr. Rafael Lima's question. So he's very specific. So Dr. Remy, it will come to you, not now, but you can prepare in the order I will do it then. After you will be Nicholas and Claire. But before we come to that order, I wonder if Professor Saka has an intervention for Chenesai Mangoma's question in relation to the harmonization of policy to increase trade and investment. What are your thoughts on postponement of AFCFTA? Do you have any thoughts on that particular one?
Not necessarily, because the harmonization question is far broader than just trade and investment. So you would have to, I would then go back to what Claire said earlier, that you have to look into the sector. I think they are far away from that. They're already starting only to harmonize then, what is it, NTBs? So there is at least an obligation, so that's a good start. But the complete harmonization of policy of trade and investment in the AFCFTA, I don't see, because there are too many regional economic communities involved at the moment. But I mean, it depends then on where the negotiation stands. So at the moment, they have even problems to continue with the service negotiations because everything has to be online. So they talk like we talk now and try to get commitments in. And that was pointed out by Reggie in another webinar last week. And I found it quite interesting because how do you then commit? How do you write that down? Is now the recording your commitment? So they are at a very difficult stage at the moment because they have to actually still find the commitments. So that's why I mentioned that at this moment they could actually look at it more broadly and put in, like when you look for digital economies, that you can tip in the IP problem of digital economies, that you could negotiate in the service sector already, service digital services, if you don't want to have it in an own agreement. And you have the chance now, if you would not delay those, so that could be an option to do earlier. But harmonization of trade and investment only if the negotiations actually continue properly, and that is at the moment the biggest problem. Let me just point to another thing that came up, and that was with regards to developing countries. There was a question not posed to me, but posed to Claire, but she wouldn't mind, I know. And that has to do with the developing country status, whether that should be replaced. Just a note that in a very recently, the US actually unilateral declared South Africa with regards to countervailing measures and anti-dumping as developed, and without actually us having a say in that. So the sovereignty is questionable in the first place. Or what should we do now? Should we go to the courts and say we dispute that? So is that now a means of actually getting clarification in a dispute about what a developing country actually is, and then you consider those statuses which are mentioned? So the sovereignty I would question in the first place, because it's a question of power. Who's determining that, and then we figure it out in a dispute.
Thank you very much. I mean, I know Professor Gathi is not a panelist here, but I was wondering if he has any thought, maybe down the line, on mega politics on that point you've noted and the classification. But hey, I'll go to Dr. Remy now, and then let Professors Perron and Gamage also go in.
Yeah, thank you, and thanks for that little point, Francisca, the question about clarification and dispute settlement. I would love to wade into that, but in discipline, let me keep my remarks. You know, that question by Professor Raphael, you know, I wish I could call a friend at this point, because really the person who's best able to answer that very specific economic question is one of the co-authors I mentioned from the CDB. What I do understand, who's an economist, and I'm a lawyer, enough said. But what I do understand, what we were trying to do, I think, is twofold. One is, I think, to fill out the proxies and increase the number of characteristics that we would look at to determine vulnerability, and build on some of the work that I know Professor Brugrio, as well as the Commonwealth Secretariat, has done on economic vulnerability. So really look at things like environmental impacts, as well as institutional ability to overcome shocks, which builds in this resilience component, not just to the things that happen to you, but what is your capacity to respond? And I think that work that was being done was in the context of a wider Caribbean project called the Multidimensional Vulnerability Index. What we tried to do somewhat creatively, we thought, was then to take that and apply it specifically to trade, and try to match, or what we called in our paper, which is available on our website, map specific proxies and vulnerabilities to specific responses in a trade context. So if, for instance, you could, on our vulnerability index, which would be weighted, so each of the proxies could be weighted based on the negotiation at hand. So if it was an agricultural negotiation, or if it was a subsidies context that we wanted to play up the vulnerability index, there were certain things about our vulnerability, certain aspects of the index or certain proxies that would be higher weighted in that context, and see what type of trade response we could then make the case for, the technical case for. So it may be greater market access in the negotiations, or the facility to designate regional institutions to do certain of the governance-related obligations that member states of the WTO have to fulfill, which is a member-driven organization as WTO members, but we belong to a regional or sub-regional grouping that could take on some of the obligations because of our limited institutional frameworks. So I think that's kind of what we wanted to do, is flesh out and make more specific the proxies, but also it's really the case of applying it more concretely to the negotiations and the negotiations that were ongoing, to see how that case could be made in a very specific way in the context of very specific negotiating demands.
Okay, so thank you very much. I may have assumed that all the panelists can see this question, so I'll just repeat the question that Raphael posed, and then just before Claire and Nicola intervenes, James, I think, has two fingers. So I'll let him come in just as soon as I finish reading the question from Raphael. So his questions were two-pronged. One to Professor Remy was that I was not aware of the new TVI. Could you explain what is the difference between the TVI and the previous Economics Vulnerability Index? And his question to Professor Gamage and Perron, that will be answered shortly, is that Remy seems to suggest, if I got it correctly, that the TVI should replace sovereignty as the criterion to determine developing country status in the context of the WTO. Do you understand this could be one of the key responses to the current challenges? Thank you. So I'll turn it to Professor Gathi for his own.
Thanks, PC. I mean, I'll come again at the end, so I don't want to interrupt the answering of this question, but I just wanted to also put on the table that perhaps in addition to all the excellent responses on the value of going back to some of the text, for example, GATT Article 18. So I'll sort of say something more about it. I think one of the panelists mentioned something about it. So in addition to all the innovations that we can come up with in terms of thinking about developing country issues, I think Article 18 of GATT has vulnerability right at the center. And even though Doha may be dead, Article 18 is still alive. The second point, which I guess I'll also, make toward the end, is that on the question of the restrictions of the PPEs, personal protective equipment, Melaku Desta has done a wonderful article, which I encourage everybody to read. It's on the website of the Economic Commission on Africa. And I think what I love about that article is the way it traces what all the panelists have emphasized about what this current moment of vulnerability have shown, that even within the EU, the restrictions that were initially imposed within the EU, that were quite restrictive and then they were loosened over a couple of weeks, is very instructive for perhaps the opening that this current moment creates. So I know I'll come at the end, so I don't want to take too much space because I know there's a question on the table.
Thank you very much. So again, it will be Perrin, Nicholas Perrin, and then Dr. Claire Gamage now. But just to anticipate, Alicia, you may be the next on the line with the question, an anonymous attendee, but I'll pose it to the audience when we get to that.
Okay, so I'm sorry, someone started to use a lawnmower, so if you can hear some noise, I do apologize. Someone's outside my house as we speak. So in terms of this question, I'm not quite sure I understood Jean-Yves saying that, but I think that I understood from what Jean-Yves had presented that the Trade Vulnerability Index, once completed, offers new opportunities for countries to then assert why they are entitled to or should benefit from certain things, and also enables them to form better responses and anticipate what responses might be necessary in those situations. What I would say about the WTO is that the self-designation problem, i.e. that countries determine their own status, is highly problematic. Countries know that it's highly problematic. As Fran intervened earlier, so I won't labor the point, you know, that the US has long challenged South Africa and China. They wanted to challenge China on its status as a developing country. And hence, that was at the very beginning of what has now been quite a protracted trade war between the US and China, and to do with anti-dumping. So I think that self-designation is a real issue. Equally, I'm not sure that the classifications that we use elsewhere are helpful, because it doesn't capture those things that Jean-Yves has mentioned in the Trade Vulnerability Index. So you may have a skew of saying you're an upper income country, for example, but have lots of moments there that signal that you are vulnerable to different things. And so I think that what the Trade Vulnerability Index would do is to help shape the conversation about how we determine what status a country should have. And I think that speaks to a bigger issue that, you know, all of us have touched upon. Well, two things. First of all, what is the purpose of trade? Is it about economic development only, or is it about livelihoods? Is it about creating better social environments in which we all live, so that we live lives we can flourish in? And part of that is economic development, but it's also much more than that. And the second point there is how we can respond to vulnerabilities using a new framework. Well, that requires people to sit down and think about how we can best construct that to capture those various aspects of development.
Yeah, so briefly, because I think, yeah, I agree with what Claire and others have said. I'm also answering to Rafael's question. So I think what we also need to bear in mind that trade creates vulnerability sometimes. So it's not that You know, you sit on the table to negotiate a deal, and then that deal might create, you know, there is some vulnerability issue you are taking to the table, but also the outcome of that deal can create vulnerability. And that's something we need to keep in mind. So this reminds me of, so when Pascal Lamy left the WTO, he gave a lecture and he was saying, well, trade is great, but we also need to accept that it creates pain. And then somebody needs to deal with that pain. So his suggestion in that lecture, that unfortunately I don't have it with me, otherwise I could quote it, was that states, national states, should deal with that. Because trade is not perfect. Trade, he would say, is not perfect. There are problems. So if we think about when trade deal is negotiated, normally it's about how much exports will grow and how much GDP will grow. I don't remember seeing people saying, oh, this trade deal will create inequality, or this trade deal will create vulnerability, and how are we going to address that? Now, if we look at, I mean, I don't remember now the name, but I know in the US there was a sort of an act passed by Congress setting a scheme to deal with problems created by trade deals. And then in other countries, maybe there are mechanisms, but we need to recognize that these mechanisms have not done a great job. Plus, we have now human rights impact assessment of trade deals, and we have other type of assessments, which I don't know so far. Maybe it's early to say how good they have been, or other people have better ideas about that. But I mean, I think that the question of vulnerability or pain, or however you want to call it, is something that is part of, you know, it's not only that people take that to a negotiating table, but also that the outcome of that table can create vulnerability. And then it's a question of, if that's unavoidable and we want to live with that, then how are we going to deal with it? That should be, you know, a key part of the negotiation, not just something left to governments, left to states to address afterwards, whatever way they can. But it should be part of the negotiation. International trade lawyers should be dealing with that too, not leave it for somebody else to do it afterwards. I think that's something that because it's easy to negotiate the deals when you don't need to deal with the cost and the risk of those. It's better just focusing on the benefits. So I mean, I don't have a clear answer to Rafael whether we should replace this or that, but I do think that trade should tackle the inequality it creates directly and not leave human rights lawyers or as other types of, you know, other area to deal with it, or national states. It should be international trade lawyers, it should be the WTO, it should be free trade negotiations that should be dealing with that as well, not leave it for somebody else. That would be my main point here.
So thank you very much to our panelists. They've kept this moving swiftly. It's fun. Alicia, I think you're responding to the next question, which I'll read now. It's from a certain anonymous attendee. It is, how can the concept of resilience be included in those BITs that already have been negotiated and are in force? Is it necessarily a big exercise of interpretation? It is necessary. The person said a big exercise of interpretation. I'm not too clear about that, but do you have it in some sense?
Okay, I actually think it's a very interesting question, and I think it is in many cases exercise in interpretation. One option that big partners could do and have been doing is issuing joint interpretive statements on a specific issue in order to reiterate the state's right to regulate, or also to narrow the scope of a provision, and hope that the arbitration tribunals will actually defer to those interpretations.
Thanks. Is there anybody else who wants to intervene on that question? Okay, so I'll pose some general ones to the panel now, and I'll put two together so that I think there's a choice with respect to that. So there's one from a certain techno pouvoir 3. In Uganda, companies in allied businesses like alcohol production were encouraged to add sanitizers production to stay afloat. This can be pursued also and not waiting only for new FDI. So I think this is more of a comment encouraging to look inwards and reverse the model of relationship. There is the other one from Chenisai, who asks, global value chains how do they unpack in Africa post-COVID-19? Who do they benefit the most? She has, I believe, maybe he, another one, which is how might we increase trade facilitation for MSMEs as a means to increase their capacity to trade so that they can become pivotal to the recovery plan post-COVID-19. So I wonder if our panelist has a take on any of those questions. There are others, but those ones are on the deck for now.
If I may respond to the last one on MSMEs yes. and trade facilitation. The quick answer to that would be to accelerate implementation of the TFA. Now, that's easy for me to say, but in many cases, especially for small states in the Caribbean, which have high income per capita, according to international organizations, we've been finding it difficult to attract funding for TFA implementation because of our high GDP per capita. So while it would be important for us to try to improve our implementation of the TFA, we can only do so to assist MSMEs. We can only do so to the extent that our funding allows us. And this brings into the conversation the whole vulnerability situation, as Jan would have rightly mentioned. The fact that, look, you know, we're already cash strapped, trying to do these developmental objectives, and then here comes this shock and increases that that impact. So that would be my answer to that.
Okay. Professor Saka, you had your hand. Yeah.
Thank you. The global value chains in Africa is a problem in itself. While they are not completely excluded, like it's sometimes said, that's not true, but the way they are excluded is for the least lucrative parts. And if one thinks about that, that is maybe what one should actually address. So how do you increase capacity, regional capacity, how you actually produce yourself in a region, the whole product, and not be part of a little screw that is actually worth nothing from the end product. And that's of course an exaggeration, but I think that is the starting point to actually increase manufacturing capacity. And for that, the industrial development is important. And that was pre-COVID-19 already the case. So there's nothing what has changed now so much other than there are a couple of more transportation problems, but this is not a new problem. The problem is the same like it was before, because actually the African countries were quite flexible in the way they dealt with cross-border transport of products. The products was not so much the problem within Africa now, it was the problem of getting into Africa now in the COVID context. So I think the question is better answered of focusing on the same thing that you should have focused before, and that is industrialization and manufacturing capacity in a regional global chain first. And then obviously you shouldn't cut yourself off from the world, and that's not possible in any event. But also focus on your I mean, there are many examples when you start, even in South Africa, they import things from China, which they have such a low skill worker capacity. Why on earth would you do that and not build your own manufacturing capacity when you have that? But yeah, so there are many things to generally improve the global value chain participation in increasing your own capacity of producing it, which is of course connected then to consumer trust, so that they actually buy the same thing, and we know that. So benefit the most, who do they benefit the most? They benefit the most if they just realize what they can do themselves, in my opinion.
Thank you very much. So I'm conscious of time. I hate to say this, but I think it is fair to also keep this sweet. So my proposal with respect to the two questions that are on the table will be, I'll give Professor Matiengai the opportunity to comment on this last question, but also Professor Gathi, I'll be prepping you to comment. If you don't mind, the two questions by Sheyi and Arinze, I'll paraphrase them once Professor Matiengai Salif is done with her intervention. And then you can also proceed to close then, except our panelists have a serious two-finger intervention.
So thanks for that. I was just going to comment on the, I think somebody mentioned from Uganda may have mentioned working with producing hand sanitizers and other things like that. And so I just wanted to talk and take this opportunity to speak about the resilience that's been shown and creativity that's been shown in a number of different African countries. For example, Senegal has developed a $1 rapid testing kit. In Kenya, textile factories have been transitioned to mask making. We've seen in Ghana the use of the quote unquote Veronica bucket, which is a bucket that takes into account the lack of widespread safe water. And so this bucket has been used and put in public places, which is just a bucket and a basin that's placed on a wooden stand, but it helps, these mini hand washing stations appearing in public areas have helped to deal with creating easy sanitation for people and is a good COVID-19 containment strategy. And we've seen this adopted in other places too, in terms of innovating with respect to using town criers to help disseminate information about COVID-19. And a number of African countries have been able to rely on previous experience with dealing with disease outbreaks, either from Ebola or Lassa fever and the like. And so there's already sort of an extant infrastructure for screening for temperatures and other things like that, that people have been in countries have been able to draw on. So I don't want to make it seem as if there is not this innovation that is taking place in the face of the pandemic. Countries are in fact responding using local knowledge and expertise to respond to the pandemic in really, I think, creative ways. So that.
I mean, thank you very much, Professor Salif. And I think something that now comes to my mind is one of the contributions also to the COVID-19 Symposium by, I think, Jacqueline, that talks about the role of African states as social innovators and how this does not mean that it's a new thing. So I think some of our participants can look at those, including Professor Salif's contribution to that symposium. Okay, so I'll now let Professor Gathi come in. I don't like to do this, but I'll give you about 5 to 7 to 10 minutes maximum. I know you won't go that far. And then we can close. Thanks.
Okay, BC, I'll be obedient. This has been a great conversation. And before I make a few remarks, just before we close, I've been invited to answer Arinze's question about how we could get some effective legal and institutional frameworks in intra-African trade for flexibilities. So it's a good question. As you know, in the African Continental Free Trade Agreement, one of the fundamental objectives written into that agreement, flexibilities, which means a variety of things. And I think this is an important and the regime that is developed under the AFCFTA, but also in a lot of the sub-regional trade regimes in East Africa, in Southern Africa, and elsewhere. And for me, this is what it means. It means not simply phased implementation depending on the capacity of the country. It also means that, for example, in the Southern African Customs Union, that the way that the customs revenues are shared is depending on the economic strength or weaknesses of the country. So, for example, the poorer countries like Lesotho and Namibia and Swaziland get a bigger share based on an economic formula they've arrived at or that have been embraced both in the AFCFTA, but also in a lot of the sub-regional economic arrangements in Africa. And hopefully we can do this more, Jan, to see whether this is true in the Caribbean. One of my favorite examples is a non-tariff barrier monitoring and reporting mechanism, which allows people to report barriers by an SMS on the phone, by a phone call, by an email. You don't have to judicialize a lot of these things to be effective. In East Africa, the ministerial body that sort of being first item on the agenda to address the questions that arise from. Example I love is the Simplified trade regime, which is a regime that allows informal cross-border traders to cross borders with very little documentation as a way of encouraging a very big portion of what is really intra-African trade, which is informal trade. On Afronomics law, we have one of, I guess, the leading scholar and person really doing work on this, Chris Nshimbi, who's really done an amazing amount of work on informal cross-border trade. So that for me is what really flexibility means. I was delighted to see the other day that Timothy Masiko, who wrote an excellent PhD thesis, won the Edward Elgar Prize in International Economic Law, and his thesis is all about flexibility. So when that book, Timothy Masiko is the name of that person. So let me say a few additional thoughts, sort of reflect. Like I said, it's been a really rich conversation. And one of the primary objectives of having a conversation like this is to figure out, whether there are ways of having a conversation about the issues that are stuck in Doha that will carry that conversation forward in a way I think that these panelists have shown is possible, and in a way that we can galvanize all our abilities and our different perspectives and our different expertise, but also to engage with people in the policy world, the activists who are very interested in this, so that we can move from academia to the real world. And so I wanted to sort of just reflect on some of the things that I think that the forthcoming written symposium as a result of this webinar might be able to show us. And I think one of the key things is how COVID-19 has showed us that placing too much emphasis on predictability and certainty and not to costs and risks and to vulnerability can be highly problematic. And that these questions of the costs and the risk and the vulnerabilities are systemic and integral to the system, and they are not peripheral to the system. And therefore that the current configuration of our trade and investment regimes, we need to think much more carefully about it, and to both think anew, but also think, like I was challenging the panelists, of sort of thinking about the things that are within both the trade and investment regimes that could be reconfigured in new directions. For example, I think that Article 18, like I said, it's right there. It's, it's governmental assistance to economic development. And we know there are many reasons that not lots of case books, so people talk about Article 18, they tend to think about it as debt letter law. I see Claire smiling because I know she's, like a lot of you, one of the people that have really sort of focused on what it means and what potential it has, so we don't always have to resort to Part 4 of GATT. With reference to international investment law, the importance of domestic law, in fact, I would say the return of domestic law is critical as well. And so I would sort of say that that is one of the other ways we can think about this in a different way. And finally, I guess maybe there are reasons to first think differently about the significance of these regional experiments in the Caribbean, in Latin America, in Africa, and elsewhere, as providing perhaps a different template for how to think about trade and investment agreements. Because I think, like I've just said, with reference to flexibility in the African trade agreements, that's a completely different conversation than the conversation about predictability and certainty that is the underpinning framework for much of what the WTO is about. And I have nothing against the WTO except that it's the WTO. So that's the first point. The second point is, I think the other thing we had today is to be really also aware that these international trade regimes are embed within them highly problematic assumptions about markets and what markets can do. And sometimes we overstate the potential for markets, at least in the sense in which especially the World Bank and the IMF tend to tell us about them, in ways that underestimate or undervalue the types of concerns that this conversation has been about, whether it's about health, whether security, and this is of those regimes. And I think we should be very clear. The point that I'd like to make is that I hope that all the panelists will be inspired to continue this conversation to build what we have developed both in the COVID-19 Symposium on the Afronomics Law blog, in this conversation, as well as perhaps articles in a future issue of the African International Economic Law Journal. Our next webinar on Monday, July the 13th, which would be Titilayo Adebola, will be on global rules, regional and national realities. So we'll be sending out information about that webinar coming up shortly. We thank you for joining us, and we thank our panelists very much for their contributions to the discussion today. And now over to you, Missy.
Yeah, thank you very much, James. I think we were treated to a bit of a slow motion movie, kind of your voice towards the end there. we show some of the challenges, right, that we're all encountering and which Franziska spoke to. So I think you've covered a lot of fields, and I won't repeat anything save to add that we do have exciting calls on Afronomics law in relation to the teaching and research of international law, global perspectives, right? So we are doing this in collaboration with the National University of Singapore. They have a teaching and research of international law association program going on at the University of Singapore. And it's an exciting collaboration. The call is live to submit blog posts till July 21st, I think. There are other ones on the lineup, but again, there are different phases in which I think, as we close, to imagine the interventions we can make, as these conversations have shown. The policy space is there, the research production space is there, the accessibility to where to place research is there. And as such, we want to thank every one of our panelists for the time they've devoted to this. We do want to thank all the participants as well for the time they've devoted to this. And we look forward to carrying on the conversation for sure in print forms, as James has said. So thank you. So long. Bye, everyone.
Thank you.